And I want to talk about observability. This is, I think, a fashionable word for monitoring, but they are a little bit different, I think. And talk about the 3 pillars of observability, which are something that get a lot of airtime in the Twitter sphere, and then talk about maybe a different way to think about the space. So this is the conventional wisdom in as few words as possible. Observing microservices is hard. Twitter, it's probably the first place I heard the word observability came from Twitter, where they had the infamous fail whale and were dealing with a lot of, brand damage. And so they created a kind of a war room situation with a bunch of people who tried to make their system observable. Their problem was that not only was it failing, but they literally could not understand it. So they wanted to be able to observe their system, which they thought was more than just monitoring it. And I like that framing. And we know it's hard. There's this idea that Google and Facebook and maybe some other companies already solved this, right? I think those of us who were there at the time might dispute the word solved. I think we tried to staunch the bleeding, that's maybe the word I'd use. And they use metrics, logging, and tracing, so we should too. And that's kind of the storyline. And I think that's almost by definition a bit of a cargo cult storyline. There is some real meat behind this too, but sometimes I don't think it's that thoughtful. And this copy Google thing, this is a very brief rant, but it drives me crazy. It just drives me absolutely crazy as an ex-Googler. Google built solutions for Google. Google is doing, their published number, which is lower than the reality, is that they're doing 2 billion RPCs per second at Google right now. It's much higher than that, but whatever, it's a lot. I've basically never seen anything close to that. I'm sure Facebook, maybe Amazon are in similar places, but that's fine. But someone at Google is much smarter than I am, Jeff Dean. He had this great rule of thumb that you can't really design any solution for more than 3 or 4 orders of magnitude of scale. So whatever works, that's why, Cassandra is totally the wrong thing if you just want to store user logins. You should use MySQL for that. It's much easier to use and probably a lot better. If it's too much data, you should use Cassandra, whatever, that kind of thing. But Google's solutions were built for a scale that basically doesn't exist outside of maybe a handful of companies that have these trillion-dollar valuations, thanks Apple, for crossing that threshold this week. And it's foolish to assume that their solutions are better. They're just more scalable, but they're actually very feature poor. Most of the stuff we did at Google is very feature poor, and it's incredibly scalable, and there's a trade-off there, and we should not be imitating what Google did without thinking about why they were doing it. Sometimes the whys will apply to us, sometimes they won't. But this blind replication of what happened at Google and Facebook is really not a good idea. I think will result in feature poor solutions, which is exactly what's happening in observability, if you ask me. So this is the, things move quickly in this industry. I already feel like this is kind of how I feel when I see the 3 pillars being talked about. It's like, okay, all right, okay, I need metrics, logging, and tracing. And I find this is sort of somewhat true, but also really limited. I think to myself, why has this caught on so much? I think part of it is that we like 3s. There's also, okay, let me first define what these things are. This is what people think of when they think of metrics. It's like time series data with lots of squiggly lines. Logging, we all know what that looks like. It's a bunch of logs and maybe a little bit of aggregation as well. On the top, this is a Kibana screenshot, of course. Tracing, this is a screenshot of Zipkin. So this is a single trace. We showed one of these earlier. Nothing wrong with a single trace, but this is what people think of when they think of tracing. I think these go in 3s. People like 3s. They like Neapolitan ice cream. They like Snap, Crackle, and Pop. They like s'mores. 3s are good, and they are easy to remember, and you don't forget any of them. But I don't think these are the right primitives. There are massive elephants in the room for all 3 of these things from a workflow standpoint, which I'll try and enumerate. This is, I like this cartoon a lot. But let's talk about them. So here's a word, I'll introduce a word nobody knew 3 years ago, except for people who were math grad students. So if you have a metric in your monitoring system, it looks like that. And let's say, there's obviously this blip around 12:45 or whatever, or I guess I can't read. I guess that would be 13. So the question is, what was that blip? And in a metric solution, the way you do this is by doing a group by on some tag. And so let's just imagine that this is request rate, and I want a group by endpoint. And so I do that group by, and you decompose this into its component pieces, and you see, oh, I get it. So, most of these things are totally flat, and then this one really spiked. And so now I know this is the one that has the problem. Okay, right? Makes sense. So this is fine. The trouble is that those dimensions are not free. And if the dimension that you want to group by has more than about 100 values, it's basically untenable. And this is what cardinality is. It's the idea that some sets, cardinality is the size of a set. When a set has more than 100 values, or maybe 1,000 depending on how much you want to pay, it's kind of not going to work for metrics. This is a massive, massive, massive usability problem for metrics because you can't explain the variance if you don't have a tag. And you can't use the tag if it's high cardinality. Like the examples we gave earlier around customer IDs are a non-starter for metrics, which is unfortunate because it's actually really important. Does it make sense? Cool. Event data volume, we've kind of talked about this over and over again today, but I think it's worth reiterating. Here's a picture again of an idea of a microservice architecture and a transaction going through it. Let's talk about how much data there is. This is not about tracing. This applies to logging as well. So you have the transaction rate. That's a component, a factor in your data volume. That grows with your business, which is okay, because as you're making more transactions, you make more money, so you can spend more money on logs and whatever. But you're also multiplying that by every microservice. This is not good, because now your business is actually not growing. You're just refactoring your engineering team, basically. And you multiply your bill times the number of services. This is a massive, massive, massive COGS problem for anyone running logging, whether that's open source, closed source, doesn't matter. If you're centralizing logging per transaction per service, your bill is proportional to your service count. And that's not proportional to your business, and so it doesn't work. So the ROI in logging becomes negative once you have logs per transaction per service. You then multiply this times the cost of centralizing the data, and you multiply that times weeks of retention so you can actually do pattern matching and comparisons, right? So this is just way too much spend, and this is a huge, huge problem for centralized logging and a problem for tracing, which we'll talk more about here. With Dapper, the way we dealt with this, in my mind, was a very blunt hammer. This is getting back to why I don't think we should ape what Google does. This was maybe necessary given the expediency that we had to be very quick about getting Dapper out. And so we just did the obvious thing where there's 100% of transactions sort of by definition at the top. And then literally the first thing you do in Dapper before anything has happened with the transaction, you throw away 99.9% of them. And then, you keep that until you're centralized regionally. So region is a data center in this case. And then to do global centralization, to do map reduces and stuff like that, we did another 10x sampling to reduce the data volume further. So I think it's really, really a massive elephant in the room for Dapper that we threw out almost all the data immediately. And this is what tracing systems conventionally do. And these are all fatal flaws for these approaches. Logs don't scale for microservices. Traces have sampling problems, and metrics have this cardinality restriction that makes it difficult to explain variance. And so what we end up seeing a lot is that people who go and deploy the three pillars, I've seen this many, many times. You go into basically any company that's using microservices, you say, do you have logs, metrics, and tracing? And they'll, at this point, usually say yes, yes, and yes. And then you'll say, are you even sort of satisfied with your ability to understand production? And they'll say, no. No. There's a huge pain point despite having the three pillars covered, because these are just data sources. I think the analogy, this thing where if you ask a kid to draw a computer, they'll draw monitors or a laptop or whatever, or these days they'll probably draw an iPad, I don't know. But that's just the UI. The computer is the CPU, and these are just the UI. We showed these earlier. This is not metrics, logs, and traces. Metrics, logs, and traces are data types, and this is the conventional way we look at metrics and conventional way we look at logs and traces. But these are really just data types, and we have to get away from this model where we confuse the data type with the application. And that's, I think, a big piece of the problem here. I would point out that, and we showed this with Dennis's demo, that the trace data can actually be used to generate time series. In some ways, time series that's a lot better, frankly, than the stuff you get out of metrics. It can also be used, you can represent it in a logging format if you want to see things chronologically ordered. This is, this one-to-one between the data sources and the UIs is a hugely self-limiting idea that people have about these technologies. And I would also say that, especially for tracing data, because, as Spoons is showing, they have a skeleton key about how systems are actually composed, you can get some really exciting stuff out of it. I mean, you can understand system dependency diagrams. This is an illustration of Netflix's Visceral project. You can do our kind of fancy histogram stuff. All this data comes from the tracing data. All these features come from the tracing data, but they're not, it's not a waterfall diagram of a trace. Clear? Yeah? So how should we think about it? And that's really what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, that's what I was just saying. There are two activities, and I think we should be talking about activities. Observability is about measuring symptoms that are important and then explaining them. There was a great question earlier about whether LightStep has some sort of machine learning or whether we automate that. The way I actually think about it is that anytime something is going wrong, the number of root causes in a modern architecture is so vast that your tool should help you winnow the search space. You should be able to test hypotheses. That's the fundamental thing we're trying to do. And the symptom you're measuring should be as close to your business need as possible. So if you need to measure a customer, you should measure a customer. You want to measure a release, you measure the release. And that requires something more than metrics, I think. So let's go back to this Dapper slide. So this is how we did it in Dapper. Spoons' talk could be summarized in, I think, this one transition. So this is Dapper, this is LightStep. So we don't do any sampling to regional storage, which I will summarize as being a satellite, and then the sampling from that point forward and all the statistics are done on demand. And this is a really different model. We actually centralize, for our biggest customers, less data than we centralize with Dapper, but we deliver a lot more value because it's informed by statistics and user behavior. I think, ideal measurement should be robust. So, the P99 here in this latency graph, really, if you want to talk about an alert, you want to know P99 right now. I think this is a far cry from being able to look at latency as a histogram to be able to drill down and understand the different behaviors interactively. This is a much more robust measurement of latency. Measurement must be high dimensional, so this cardinality restriction needs to go away. If it's still there, we're going to basically be unable to measure the symptoms we care about from a business standpoint. So the cardinality thing needs to be resolved by, this is an animated GIF that we took of adding a specific customer ID. This is actually our internal system here, not our demo app, allowing us to drill down to a particular customer ID, switching it to a different customer, and you can see how different the performance is. This is a large customer versus a small customer, by the way. And it's really valuable for us to be able to do that sort of thing. The ideal explanations, getting away from measurement, need to be real time. We need to test hypotheses immediately. You can't wait more than a couple of seconds to test them, and the data has to be within 10 seconds, I'd say. Otherwise, you can't respond to incidents quickly enough. People are looking to resolve incidents within minutes, so it really costs you if your iterations take a long time or if you have to wait a minute for the data to be there, which is a problem for centralized logging. And they need to be global. And so this is kind of the classic distributed tracing thing where you see the waterfall diagram, but you need it in the global context of knowing that this was an outlier. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing here's performance. We don't know if it's good or bad until we compare it to how things looked an hour or a day ago. If you're going across your system, looking at things that other developers are working on, you're not going to know what's normal. You need to have the tool help you understand that context. So, yeah, there's two activities. I think we need to stop using data types to describe our solutions. I actually did talk to someone who's not a LightStep employee, who's sort of an analyst, about this idea yesterday, and their feedback was that I think customers have been burned by vendors so many times that the three pillars are attractive because you can't lie about data types, It's like you've got to be honest with us about that part. And I totally get that. I think that we also should yeah, it's fine to ask about data types. I think it's better to ask about activities and be like, let's really talk about how do you actually measure performance? Let's be specific. Let's talk about cardinality and the robustness of the data. And is it a throwaway thing, or can you actually answer the questions I need to know as a business and ask them specifically? And then can you explain those anomalies? I think logs, metrics, and traces are part of the solution, but to me that's implementation detail for vendors if they want to use these things or not to get at these two kind of crucial ideas of measurement and explanation. And this is the way that we think about the product and the way we think about the space. I'm excited to present this to you all. I think the wording probably can be made flashier, frankly, and we can find better ways to talk about this as a collective industry, but I do want to get away from talking about the data sources. It's very limiting in the way that we analyze the solutions.
How big right now do you believe the market for this is? I mean, you've been talking about Lyft and Netflix and these cloud-first hyperscalers. Lots of even large enterprises aren't hugely distributed right now and haven't implemented a lot of microservices. Mm-hmm. So are there enough customers to go around right now? And how big do you have to be to really think about the, cost benefit of this?
Good question. Of course, the answer is it's infinite. The market is huge. I'll give you a really totally candid answer. I do think the market is very, very large. And the way I analyze it, it's oddly, again, about people, not about systems. I think of this about powerful software. LightStep is trying to, our company, not just this product, is trying to make powerful software more beneficial. Like, we want to make it faster, easier to build. We want to make it enjoyable to build. That's kind of the way we think about the market. And I don't think that if someone's running a WordPress site, they should not care about LightStep. That should be factored out, right? If someone is relying on some other vendor to do all the heavy lifting, they probably also shouldn't care about LightStep. But at some point, you're building powerful software, which, if you want to continue to exist, is going to require hundreds of developers. That's the trigger. The developers are the trigger. And it's as soon as you have hundreds of developers, you have no choice but to split things into pieces. Again, I don't really mind what it's called. If microservices become something else in a few years, that's fine. The idea is that you can't have 100 developers working on a monolith. It just doesn't work. And if you farm that out and have it done by contractors, you'll lose in the market. So I think we're betting on the winners, frankly. I think people who are going to actually build complex software at scale have to split their systems up for managerial reasons. And the second they do that, the problems we're talking about are just, it's immediate. And in our sale, we have logos on our website for customers that we have logo rights for. There are others that we don't, and then there's prospect discussions and so on. I don't have any doubt about the market. LightStep's ability to win is dependent on our competitors and our ability to execute and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that we're filing our S1 right now or something, but the market is definitely there. And certainly outside of the hipster realm that I presented earlier, it's into the large enterprises. If they're actually investing in software development, they all have initiatives. I've yet to find one that doesn't have an initiative to move to a more distributed architecture, call it what they may. Because they have to. And then the problems that we're describing here just fall out of that transition almost immediately, I think. Does that make sense? Hopefully it doesn't feel too fluffy. It's a great question, and I don't take it lightly. I wouldn't have started this company if I didn't believe that, so you're kind of asking the wrong guy, but that's how I see it.
So it's basically, you've already answered in a way that this is aimed as either big organizations who are basically development heavy, or software houses, for example. So if a company was considering LightStep to become part of their monitoring environment, would they have to then liaise with you heavily to determine how this is all deployed or designed and what they're going to monitor, fine-tune it? Or is it something, you just get it in, have a few satellites, and then off you go?
Very good question. It really depends. We have customers that have no interest in liaising with us, and that's great, and they've done during the first conversation we had with them, they'd already integrated and saw data and everything, especially if they have in-house tracing that can be done very quickly. We have other customers that they don't need it necessarily, but they really want to have guidance from a vendor that has seen this transition happen many times to help them plan out their own strategy. And this isn't just about company stage, it's more of a culture kind of thing. I think some cultures, even within larger enterprises, the teams that are kind of DevOps type teams that build this type of system often look a lot like a miniature version of, well, not miniature, they look like an embedded Lyft or Twilio within these larger organizations. So it's a very cultural thing that you're asking, actually. And it has as much to do with their desire to have, it's not a professional services thing, but whether they want guidance around how to do this or whether they'd rather do it themselves. And we're quite comfortable with either of those options.
Actually, I think a follow-up thing could be to this, that because of your monitoring the software that wherever you're deploying, I think you, in the process of that, will then see more and more practices of how people are or companies are developing their microservices. And I sort of think of this microservices ethos or techniques basically to be more in line with like the OSI model, where there were standard interfaces, and every layer has a standard input-output, so that there's no confusion about how they should talk to each other. But if you don't follow that same kind of process in a microservices architecture, again, you run into some problems because of that. So because you are able to then see it, maybe you could then, start educating on those things as well. What are the best practices, how you should avoid these problems as well.
Yeah, we've been talking about writing down more of our thoughts around that, because I think one of the concerns I have about microservices migrations is less so now than it was a few years ago, but people often think, okay, I get it, so my team should operate independently. And then they let them go and develop on a completely different stack. So every service team has a different language, a different framework, different choices, and that's a mess. For cross-cutting concerns like security and monitoring and deployment and testing, that's a total mess. So it is important to give people the flexibility to build independently, but it's also important to choose a short kind of prefix menu of things that developers are allowed to use within any organization. I'm not advocating for one or the other, but that kind of, there's too much heterogeneity sometimes in those choices, and then it gets very difficult to make sense of the global whole. So I do think standardization, at least within an organization, is incredibly important to do this well. And it would be great if the industry in general could do that. There's a nice group of vendors and open source projects working together with the W3C to actually standardize on the actual bits and bytes that are sent over the wire for tracing data right now, so that that's interoperable between vendors, for instance. And I think that sort of thing is really important and beneficial. We participate in that.